Howdy, Pima Aztecs. So this is central nervous 5, the meninges, and so we'll have 2 more after this. So we'll have 7 total videos for the central nervous system. Let's give a check, make sure our pen's working. Okay, so you've probably heard of meningitis. Well, that's just an inflammation of these structures, brain structures, called the meninges. So let's take a look at this cartoon. So here's our skull, and they take a piece here, and then they bring it over to this cartoon, and you can see that this tan piece here would be the skin, the scalp, and then this would be the bone, the cranial bone here, and then deep to that you would find the first meninge called the dura mater. So that would be this guy right here. This would be the dura mater, and then this white stuff with the kind of spidery arachnoid looking things hanging down, that would be the arachnoid mater. And then this is, the line isn't lined up correctly, but this thin piece of mater right here that dives into a sulci and is really close to the surface of the brain, that's called the pia mater. So the meninges surround and protect the brain and spinal cord. So the dura mater is most superficial, the arachnoid mater is the central layer, and the pia mater is the deepest layer. And mater just means mother. So dura mater means tough mother, arachnoid mater means spider mother, and pia mater means delicate mater, because it's the delicate mother, because it's just this really thin piece of tissue that sits or is right next to the folds of the cerebral cortex. So now let's look at some more pieces of this. So we already said this top piece is the skin of your scalp, and then this white stuff, that's the periosteum, that's the connective tissue on a bone. So, and then we said this part was the bone. And then now I'm going to say that the dura mater has 2 parts to it. It has a periosteal part. So remember, the periosteum surrounds the bone. So there's the periosteal component of the dura mater, and then here's the meningeal part of the dura mater. So the dura mater is the most superficial layer. It has 2 parts, periosteal and meningeal. And then just deep to the dura mater is the subdural space. So now we have to come over here because the subdural space is labeled over here. So here's the meningeal layer of the dura mater. So it goes here. This is all meningeal layer of the dura mater. And then just between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which is here, because you can see all these spidery legs hanging down from the arachnoid mater, just deep to the dura mater is this space, and it's called the subdural space. And then, so here's the arachnoid mater, this white thing, and you have these parts of the arachnoid mater called arachnoid villi, and they protrude through the dura mater. So you can see, so here's dura mater, and then here's dura mater over here, and then you have this arachnoid villus protruding through the dura mater, and it goes into this region called the superior sagittal sinus. And it's set up this way so that the cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF, can be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So this is a cartoon of the septa, or the walls of the dura mater. So again, you can tell this is the bone, and then this is the superior sagittal sinus that we saw in the last cartoon. So superior, it's the most superior sinus, and then there's this little piece here called the straight sinus, and then there's these falx cerebri, and the tentorium cerebelli, and the falx cerebelli, and these are all parts of the dural septa, or the wall of the dura. So now let's look at the next meningeal layer, the arachnoid mater. Remember, that's the spider mother, so it's this white piece. It's got all these spidery looking things dangling from it. And then part of the arachnoid mater is this thing called an arachnoid villus that punches through the dura mater. And then just deep to the arachnoid mater and just superficial to the pia mater is a space, and it's called the sub, because it's beneath the arachnoid mater, so it's called the subarachnoid space. So it's space below the arachnoid, above the pia mater, and it contains the cerebrospinal fluid. It also contains blood vessels. So see this, here's a vein, it's blue, it's cut in a longitudinal section. Here's an artery, here's another vein of that live in the subarachnoid space. Okay. And then the pia mater is the delicate mother. That's this stuff right here. It's a vascularized connective tissue, so that means it has blood vessels in it, and it clings tightly to the brain. So you can see I'm following the pia mater here, and it clings right to the sulci and the gyri of the cerebral cortex. So cerebral spinal fluid. So this is a sagittal section of the brain, and here's our superior sagittal sinus. Oh, I forgot to tell you what a sinus is. So a sinus can be like your sinuses in your head, but a large vein is also called a sinus. So this is the superior sagittal sinus, and we're using the term sinus in the context of being a large vein. So the cerebral spinal, if you come down here, it tells you that the cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF, is made by the ependymal cells. So that's these red tufts of capillaries, and here they all contain ependymal cells, and they live in ventricles. We'll look at what the ventricles are in a minute, but we have a lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and fourth ventricle. But these the ependymal cells that make the CSF live in the ventricles, and that CSF will flow into this thing called the subarachnoid space. So if we find, here's an arachnoid villus, here's an arachnoid villus, so then the subarachnoid space would be here. So you make cerebrospinal fluid, and it flows into the subarachnoid space. So let's just track some. So here's some cerebrospinal fluid being made, and it flows here. It flows here, and now it's in the subarachnoid space, the CSF is. And then it can also, some of the CSF flows into the spinal cord. So here's the CSF flowing into the spinal cord. So cerebrospinal fluid is located in the brain and around the spinal cord. The fluid that the CSF is, it's similar to plasma. So it came from plasma. So these red things, these are tufts of capillaries called a choroid plexus, and the plasma can seep out, and the ependymal cells use the plasma to make cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is similar to plasma, except there's no red blood cells in it. Cerebrospinal fluid contains glucose, protein, potassium, and sodium, just like plasma does. The cerebral spinal fluid gives buoyancy to the brain, so it reduces the brain weight by 97%, so it makes your brain nice and light. And the CSF protects your brain or the central nervous system from trauma, getting hit. So the ventricles, where the cerebral spinal fluid is made and where the cerebral spinal fluid circulates, include 2 lateral ventricles. So here's the right lateral ventricle. Here's the left lateral ventricle. And then the cerebral spinal fluid will flow from the lateral ventricles into the 3rd ventricle, which also makes cerebral spinal fluid. And then the 3rd ventricle will send its cerebral spinal fluid into the 4th ventricle. And this is a frontal view. This is a side view of the ventricles. This thing kind of looks like I don't know what that looks like. It looks like a duck or a chicken. Not sure. Interesting. So, yeah, so I just told you all that stuff. So the cerebral spinal fluid moves between, so it's made in the ventricles, moves between the ventricles, and enters the subarachnoid space from the 4th ventricle. So this thing right here, all the CSF that you made from your lateral ventricles and your 3rd ventricle will all flow to the 4th ventricle. Then from the 4th ventricle, the CSF will go into the subarachnoid space. And there are lots of other terms associated with the ventricles, but it's important to note that if you are cerebral spinal fluid and you are trying to flow from the lateral ventricles, you'd have to flow, if you want to get from the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle, then you have to go through this interventricular foramen. If you want to go from the 3rd ventricle into the 4th ventricle, you have to go through this structure called the cerebral aqueduct. Okay. And I told you that the CSF was made by this red stuff. That's called a choroid plexus. So, and the ependymal cells in this choroid plexus, they line the ventricles and they make the CSF. Okay, total CSF volume is about 150 mils. You make about 500 mils. Well, a 20-year-old male that weighs 160 pounds will make about 500 mils of CSF daily. CSF is made and then it's constantly, the CSF is constantly being reabsorbed back into the blood via these the villi. So you can see this black arrow, it's taking the CSF into the villus. The villus will go back into this subdural sinus. From there, it's a vein, so it'll take all the blood. It'll get the blood back into the vascular system. And there's a condition called hydrocephalus. If you have a blocked pathway in any of these pathways that CSF is flowing when you're young, you can build up cerebral spinal fluid and you can get a very large head. So this is a flow chart that just tells you that CSF is produced in the choroid plexus. CSF flows through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space via the median and lateral apertures. So if you are in the 4th ventricle and you want to get into the subarachnoid space, you have to flow through these apertures or openings to get into the subarachnoid space, and some of the CSF will go into the central canal of the spinal cord.